I recently uploaded a Banlist prediction video, and let's just say I was humbled. Not only was this one of the most disliked videos on the channel, it also received a ton of comments letting me know that I am coping. Now this might seem as though I'm complaining, but I'm not. In fact, I am very thankful to be part of a community that not only calls me out when I am wrong, but also provides constructive criticism when needed. So today I plan to correct those mistakes by consolidating your feedback into a list that we both can feel proud of. So let's get into it. Okay, so before we do, I wanted to take a moment to quickly go over the previous list and what you guys had to say about it. Looking at this list, some of you might be pulling your hair out. Others of you might be curious. For those of you who are, I'll leave a link to that video in the description so you can hear some of my reasoning for those picks. Now, as for the cards on this list that I banned, most of you have agreed that Fiendsmith needs to be checked in some way or another. However, a lot of you disagree with regards to Lurie being that pick. Well, why? Well, for two reasons. Firstly, Lurie is set to receive an alt art reprint, so it doesn't make sense to write it off just yet. Also, Fable are set to receive new support soon, so I have to agree with this not being the right time to hit something like Lurie, which is why I've picked something else. But we'll get to that in a bit. Also, a lot of you agree that Kashtira needs to be hit in some way or another, but disagree with indirectly hitting them through birth. My logic is that banning birth means that players can't use the Kashtira monsters as free extra deck material. Take a look at Tempai and Crystron. Both of them use Kashtira to access Cherubini, which they can't do if birth is banned. This is just one example of them. However, I'm not opposed to hitting the Kashtira stuff directly. I'm as tired of them as you are. Now, you guys mentioned that there's no reason to hit Deck Lockdown. While it is an annoying card, you have mentioned that it's just not seen enough plays to justify it, and I have to agree with that. Moving on to the limited list, there weren't many complaints other than it being too soon to limit Witch and Wanted. My logic is that Azamina White Forest generally only runs 1 to 2 copies of these cards anyway, so it's not like limiting this will affect that deck too much. It's only there in place to sort of prevent Azamina spam. However, let's take a step back from any preemptive hits and take a look at the semi-limited list, which was maximum cope. Yeah, I think let's just leave it at that. Now, without all of that out of the way, let's take a look at what should have been on the list. So looking at the new ban list, I've got 3 names on it: Moon, Exciton, and Griffin. Now, I think we can all agree that the correct hit is to limit Engraver and Tract. But we also agree that it is unlikely that Fiendsmith will take a direct hit given that they have yet to be reprinted. Furthermore, while I think a Necroquip is one to consider banning, some of you have mentioned that it is a TCG exclusive and thus it is unlikely to make the cut. Which then leaves us with the enablers, Moon and Exciton. Unfortunately, you can't ban Moon without Exciton, so it's either both or none. We can also kind of justify, rationalize, whatever you want to call it, the Exciton hits, since there's also a minor hit to Pure Iziel which needs a check. That aside, what does banning these cards do? Simply put, it means that players will have to hard draw an Engraver or Tract to access their Fiendsmith lines. This isn't too hard to do considering they can play 3 of each. But what it does mean is that it puts this engine in the sort of the same realm as Azamina. In other words, players will need to devote a lot of their main and extra deck to an engine that they can't reliably access. However, while this does make it less consistent, it doesn't affect the overall ceiling of the engine, and I think that's a fair compromise to make. Although I would still love to see Engraver and Tract to 1 instead. Now looking at Griffin, nothing to say here, we've spoken about this enough in the previous list. We all agree it's annoying, it has to go. So let's take a look at the limited list instead. Not much has changed in terms of the limited list except for swapping out the Wanted package for Unicorn and Fenrir. Realistically, I can only see Fenrir being limited, if anything, but it makes sense to limit both since Unicorn is such an annoying card to deal with. Extra deck space is once again at a premium, and being able to look at your opponent's extra, gain insight into what they're playing, and banish and import a one-off feels a little too good. Especially since summoning Unicorn before you start committing to play means that your opponent has to think twice before hand trapping. I think we can agree this is reason enough to limit it as well. Moving on to the semi-limited list, I think we can agree that this current list looks a lot better than the previous one. Yeah, no Gamma, no Coldbite, no Brand Diffusion. But instead we have Misk going back to 2. This isn't really going to change the format in any way. It just means that Dino Duelists get to play their deck again. Plus, with the addition of Yugioh, it feels like the perfect time to give the deck a much needed buff. The same can be said about Shavara. Unchained aren't doing anything at all. In fact, if Fiendsmith has to get hit, it's all the more reason to give this deck the tools to become at most rogue playable. Yeah, it's not going to be format destroying as it was in the past, it's just going to maybe find its way into the format as like some kind of contender. Finally, I've put Sekka's Light to 2. It might seem a bit risky considering players can technically run it in Chaos Thunder Dragon, but I think the deck is a little past its sell by date. So let's let them try it and see what happens. We can always put it back to 1 later, if it's a problem. I don't think it'll be. As for cards to be unlimited, I've once again put the pearly cards on the list. Deck could need a buff, nothing to say there, but I've also unlimited Striker Dragon and Eva due to popular demand.